Feeling into yesterday, it feels like we should just go into the material. It takes sometimes quite a bit to get to know each other energetically, and there are always like attunements because there's really so much. So I'm constantly looking for a starting point. I think the experiences yesterday were good. A lot of what was shared actually brings up like terms and concepts that I feel could help to manage not just the energy but also the information. I think when you're trying to elaborate on something by way of discourse, one way to do it is to describe something. In religion, there were these beings that were pointing at the stars. And sometimes, instead of having a relationship or building a relationship with the stars, we build a relationship with the finger. That's, for me, often a mode of description, where instead of accessing the stars, it's so much simpler to just access the finger. We can either describe, or sometimes when people have experienced and studied enough, what they're looking for is more of the explanation. These two ways of elaborating have very different lengths. Explanation obviously takes a lot more time. It takes space, it takes years. Description can happen in a day, an hour, or a couple of minutes. So I think you need to determine inside yourself, are you looking for a description or are you yearning for an explanation? Within the inner dance process, there are descriptions and there are explanations, and often when you work with spiritual terms and energy terms, what you would end up with are descriptions. That doesn't make it less, because descriptions can often hold something very big quickly, like easily. But often when you conduct therapy and when you start holding spaces long enough, explanation becomes important in the long term, because there are many invisible things that descriptions cannot provide. That's where science and spirituality need to have coffee together. And if you're fasting, maybe some water or tea. They're probably the same. They're both just trying to explain something about reality and consciousness that lives in that reality. We would bring up many possible things about the body that are explainable. A lot of the areas concerning the mind are descriptive in length. Take up psychology or psychoanalysis. There's a lot of things there that aren't going to be concrete. In the body, it's a whole bunch of things that are sensory in nature. So we've already agreed that we're interested in both. One starting point is descriptive that could lead to explanatory length would be, there's something you would easily notice in the energy where something goes up, something rises up, something activates, and then something goes down. So you need to account for these things. There's so many different terminologies that you can use. For me, that's definitive of the trance. If you want to understand how trance works or expanded states of consciousness, very often people are getting quite focused on the arising. You know, people say, okay, Shakti rising, Kundalini rising. That would maybe commit more to the evolution aspects of spirituality, where I need to raise my vibration. It's very, very low. But if you stick to that, what you would find out quite easily is that that doesn't happen unless there's the involution also taking place. Something needs to go down. And maybe you can explain that as electricity and magnetism. I like that explanation, because when you think of the basic building elements of life, it begins with light. Light is merely an electromagnetic wave. Electricity and magnetism turning into each other. It's a double helix. And you can use that as a possible metaphor for vibration, which is maybe in the gut, you know, when they say like women think from the gut, from the body, from intuition. Magnetism could be that which is mental. So something needs to go down for something to go up. So that's maybe a very, very simple, more physics-based explanation. In the inner dance, what is more useful is to think of this from something a lot more tangible, something a lot more solid. So what we perceive would be what needs to go down in the first stages would be the sympathetic nervous system that needs to relax. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is that which we tend to raise up. And at some point they meet here. We're trying to look for the middle space or the meeting point where the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system would co-activate. For those who have been watching some of our training material or have been to past trainings, this is one of the basic tenets of how the energy happens. We're talking about like fear or anxiety or excitement. And then we're talking about trust, rest, digest. The most basic explanation for why and how the inner dance state of awareness takes place. So let's just look at the basic elements of this. The sympathetic nervous system extends in the middle region of the spine, and the parasympathetic nervous system extends from the top and in the bottom. So were we to look at what that actually looks like, let's go to the trunk. I think it's really, really interesting for us to observe that fear has a region. It's from T1 to L2. So when people tend to touch like the chest or the abdomen, oh, okay, so that's not peeking. That was the shirt, yeah, okay. Okay, this is T1, this is T1. It's near the collarbone, all the way to L2. L2 is here. When people start pushing folks, like here in these sections, what they're doing is they're actually sending signals to the ganglion, which are bundles of axons, extending through from the spine outwards to the brain, to the rest of the body, that when you want to communicate that it's time to get excited, it's time to be afraid, so that you can look at the fear, you're actually able to activate the heartbeat. When we activate the heartbeat, something rises up. It's as simple as that. And a lot of that is chemical, a lot of that is circuitry. You're touching people's hearts, and everything you do will alter the heart. Everything that happens with the heart will alter the brain state. And that will alter the breath. And then that will alter the liver, the pancreas, the digestive system, the reproductive system, the lymphatic system. What you're looking for is, how do I understand a central governing system that would allow me to hold all of these very intense processes as one. It's already quite complicated to be doing that to one person. But if you have 100 people in a room, how do I talk to everyone's hearts? What would be my very careful signaling mechanisms that allow me to slow things down? Let's say involution would be slow, and then evolution would be fast. You want to slow something down, and then you want to speed something up simultaneously. So many tools for that. In inner dance, the main tool we've discovered a long time ago is you just play super slow, super fast music at the same time. You actually co-activate the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. That is actually possible. And our theory is that that's actually quite rare, based on many studies regarding what's called the autonomic nervous system. It doesn't usually happen. When you're supposed to be awake, you're awake. And when you're supposed to be relaxed, that's the only time you slow down. And that's usually at night. You're supposed to be vigilant, active, and in a fight or flight. Like you're ready to go to war, like during the day, and then you're ready to give up and surrender during the night. So what you're doing is you are counteracting a lot of the inbuilt autonomic systems. Now, autonomy is really more about control. We're interested in control, but the work that we're doing is actually to get people to let go of control. Therein lies your paradox. Can I control the letting go of control? This is what we're studying. So the autonomic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that controls you. You can't control it. You can't control your heartbeat. You cannot control your brain waves. You cannot control your chemistry unless you really train, maybe for decades, to, okay, I'm going to control my heartbeat. It's going to go into 98 BPM. Right? I don't know anyone who can do that because it's too complex. Would you like to be doing that? I'm going to control all my enzymes. I'm going to track all my neurotransmitters. I'm going to track every single hormone, trillions of cells, billions of neurons. I'm going to be a control freak to the max. I'm going to time all of that. So you have to thank your body for having this amazing ability to control, this amazing, overwhelming number that is inside you. There are more connections in your brain than there are stars in the galaxy. So your autonomic nervous system, God bless it, him, her, is doing that for you. But it's overwhelmed because of the way evolution has been happening, and involution needs to happen now. We're hyper-stimulated. We're overwhelmed. People are anxious, and we lost control over that which is in control. So now it's in control of us. The autonomic nervous system is controlled by who? It's actually controlled by your past. Every experience you had that was traumatic, threatening, scary, taught your heart to pulse in a certain way. It taught your breath, the programming is there. So then think about the practice that we're doing. Asking people to lay down, closing their eyes, and then starting to stimulate and trigger them. It triggers the autonomic nervous system. And depending on how you either pull something up or bring something down, you will influence either an experience of emotion, of observation, of anxiety or stability. This is what we're learning. We are students of the autonomic nervous system. Somewhere down the line, maybe years, decades of studying this, we will understand the control mechanisms of the human. That could lead to new formulations in medicine, new ways of understanding the schooling system. But if you want to understand how thinking happens, there must be an understanding of how especially the old brain works. Now, what is responsible for the autonomic nervous system, as I just said, it's the old brain. There are many brain models. One of the ones that I find, let's say, the most useful would be Ned Herman's 4-brain model. Okay, how many brains do you have? Technically, you have 2 brains because they're split in half. You have the left and the right hemisphere. So you can account for that. There's the left and then there's the right. So how did you end up with 4? One of the other theories would be the triune brain theory. I think that's Paul MacLean. That you have the upper brain And then in the middle would be the emotional brain, and beneath that would be the reptilian brain, the animal brain. So then that means you have four brains. You have the upper brain, the lower brain, the left brain, and the right brain. The old brain would be the basal ganglia, the areas near the brainstem. They perform the autonomic functions. And the new brain, which should be the neocortex, would be the part that holds thinking, higher systems of interpretation. The left brain is sequential, so we might say metaphorically that this is masculine. So let's say the left brain would be masculine. The left brain would be, and the right brain, being non-sequential, would be feminine. I find that really interesting because if the higher brain would be considered masculine and the emotional brain would be considered feminine, then there's actually a masculine, a feminine, a masculine, and a feminine masculine. Inner dance, there are different possible ways of looking at this, but let's say this could be the outer, this is the inner, and then this is stillness, and this would be movement. It doesn't fit. Let's just say that's movement. Inner dance, inner movement is here, because it's the feminine that's the lower, and it's the feminine that's the right. And this is the masculine. This is where the son, the father, the grandfather all hang out together and drink beer, Belgian beer. Yes. Oh, sorry, this is not feminine. Yes, you're right. So let's say there. Thank you. Let's clean that up. This is my brain. It really looks messy usually. Yeah, you guys help me. So Ned Herman actually came up with really amazing possible names for this. This is called the logician. This is called the communicator. If I could change that, I would call it the dreamer. And then this is the visionary. And I think this is the most important. This is called the organizer. Now here, because it's the feminine, this is messy. It's very hard to structure the feminine. Certain times of the month, we just can't talk to you. You're rhythmic. You're not like the men where you can rely on them every day. They're usually okay. The sun comes up. You're like the moon. You confuse us. So this is messy. But there is enough of the feminine here that's also mixing with the masculine. So this is where we organize things. The left brain, but still also the basal ganglia brain. So what I would like to do today is to understand how are we activating the lower brain in response to the higher brain, and the left and the right brain, so that you can feel more empowered, confident, trusting that you can hold some of the invisible parts, that you can use the spiritual terms that are important concepts that you don't want to need to push away, because that's what human beings will be working with. But how do you build a science underneath that, whether you talk about it or not? You want to model your practice. And it's really up to you. If you want to hold something intense, you want to hold something gentle. Say medical practitioners, they can't do intense. In the beginning, the opening would be pain management. It would be stabilizing, certain stages of cancer, and so on and so forth. People within the spiritual modality, that could be more intense. That's not a rule, though. Like maybe some medical practitioners might experiment with something cathartic if we perceive that that's really what's going to heal. But when your opening is conservative, you need to be able to formulate your processes so that you're not just going to copy whatever else is happening out there. There might be many modalities of these that we haven't seen before. So if you're going to start to introduce this to parents who want to facilitate their small children, it can't be the same wave. You need to be able to reconstruct the wave according to the situation, and you really need to listen to the collective minds of the audience in representation. It could also be true that the medical practitioners or the teachers or parents in Sri Lanka, in India, in China, won't be thinking the same as the ones in Ukraine or just anywhere else, Italy or London. Try to meditate long before you do things autonomically. Listening can be intuitive, not having to think about it. And a lot of what you're doing probably works in your location. So let's begin to think about some of the sharings that came up yesterday. We heard about expectation or anticipation. And what happened was, because the sound system was weird, we weren't able to bring the usual heart pumping wave that a lot of people are used to. Some people were waiting for that because that was what was used primarily in a lot of the trainings that you might have attended. And when you train your body to get used to certain patterns, you actually acclimatize. You'll get used to it and your body won't be used to other styles. So it's important to study the playlist models that are emerging in different areas. Inner dance tries to hold quite a lot of different models. There were some people who went very, very deep. Because of the limitations of the sound system, we weren't able to activate the sympathetic nervous system. So today, the sound system was better, and we were able to handle the quadrants a lot more today, giving us more models for you to compare. Oh, that is different from yesterday. So you can see. There are a lot of space holders in the world. What they do is they choose maybe 10 songs or 12 songs, line it up in Spotify, and then sequence them so that they'll play it every single time. Big advice, don't do that. To give people anticipatory elements that they get used to. If they know that, okay, that song's coming up, that song's always going to make me cry. Okay, I'm really excited. I'm going to cry right now. Oh, I'm crying. Oh, it's amazing. I'm crying. That sad music is now coming. I'm going to slow down. It's going to bring me to space. When you teach a body to do that, and then when they build certain chemical pathways that get used to the same wave every time, what you're doing is creating a spiritual addiction. They will want the high more and more. One of the dangers of that is called tolerance. The more people get the hit, like let's say the stimulant, when they get the hit, stimulants like glutamate, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, every time people get stimulated, the body counteracts that and sends out depressant chemicals to try to balance out the heavy stimulation that's happening. You can imagine if people just kept stimulating themselves more and more and more, what's going to happen is they're going to have a heart attack. The heart can only beat so fast. So one category mistake many facilitators make is they get overexcited in the beginning, and then they create a wave where everything is just stimulatory. We don't need to technically always worry about that because the body does have innate homeostatic abilities. If it knows that, okay, he or she's going to do that to me again, they're going to go again to that workshop that's going to give me the hit. It actually secretly protects you from that. So before you stimulate, it's already sending out depressants. And that is why some people don't feel that much anymore. Every time they do it, and then, oh, why is it not working? Does it mean I need more? So they keep going back thinking, okay, I need more. I need more push. I need to be, someone needs to stand on me. Someone needs to slap me. Someone needs to maybe burn my hand or something in order to trigger. What they don't realize is there's so many depressants that's slowing down the heart in order to protect people. Right? That's why people need to take more drugs. Because they built a tolerance. That's how tolerance works. Tolerance is one of the main reasons why people have a drug overdose. Because when you take more and more and more, and then suddenly when you're in a situation where your body didn't send out enough depressants, because maybe you changed the location you were taking the drug, or you changed any situation where your body didn't have the signaling systems, then they take too much. That's how an overdose happens. When you don't have enough depressants to combat the stimulants. The opposite could be true. If you're taking a lot of depressants, your body actually sends out stimulant chemicals. So when someone takes too much depressants because the heroin, the sleeping pills aren't working so much anymore, when the body isn't able to send out enough glutamate and, the heart slows down and then it just stops. So it's actually quite cool that the body knows how to balance things out. So it's really interesting, I think, to think about this. Yes, Sylvia. Yes. Mm. It's an interesting question. We don't probably know the answers yet, but because the sleep playlists are built in a way that's hiding the stimulation, because people are sleeping, you're not allowed to actually wake them up. There's a lot of delta and then there's a lot of gamma counteracting with each other, because in a usual wake-based workshop session, the stimulation needs to be a lot more obvious. We could look at this from a training perspective. There's really two things that a facilitator is doing. There's only really two things that you need to be doing in order to bring people into a healing process or a transformation process. You need to get them to go down, yes? To go down means you need to open the space. So you need people to be able to trust the space. To create enough delta frequencies to get them to slow down, to open up. And then when they're open, usually that's when you can start to trigger them. They're open. Their defenses are down, they're not fighting. And when they're open, when people start doing, or they start making the clicking noises, or they start doing that, it enters their body. It sends out neurotransmitters and hormones that are interrelated to fear and excitement. Excitement and fear are the same when it comes to the sympathetic nervous system. It's rapid beating of the heart. If you can hold both of these together, that's what we learn. That's when healing happens. So going back to the sleep playlists, and I think a lot of people don't even know what we're talking about when we mention the sleep playlists. You could talk about that later, that a lot of people are doing inner dance while they're sleeping, and it's actually a lot more powerful. If you're going to sleep anyway, why not journey? It's brought so much healing to children. We design it. That's really situational in this regard. The trigger mechanisms, in other words, when people are sleeping, it can't be that much. Otherwise, you bring them into beta consciousness, which is to wake them up. To bring them into REM state, the trigger needs to be very, very slow, very light. We want to talk about the higher regions and the lower regions. Is there a difference? What's the difference? I think through this conversation, we can tackle many of the problem spots that we've been trying to address since yesterday. Where there might be what is too much? That's one of the questions. When might there be too much? How do I know it's too much? How many times are people allowed to do this per week, per day? How do we know when it's too much? Some people are interested in the brain waves. Okay, there's delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. So when you think about that, a lot of those would be trigger mechanisms that will affect the circuitry or the electrical pathways, and then it will affect the chemistry. Chemistry is interesting because the effects of chemistry are long-lasting. The effects of circuitry are very short. So when you hear people say, oh, this changed my life when I had this experience, often that actually doesn't mean anything when it's just a change in a state of consciousness. That's electrical. Because when you change the electrical pathways, usually people go back to normal after a week or after a couple of days. What really sustains the state is the chemistry. If you are able to change the hormones, not just the neurotransmitters, then that's more long-lasting. That would last for months or years. And that takes a while. Let's ask the question then, very straightforwardly, why, how does it happen, that thing that we've been demonstrating there in the middle yesterday with the two women who so bravely offered their bodies, and then for you who's experiencing, and for you who's beginning to hold bodies. Why does it happen? And when is it not happening? We would need to go into the brain and the body. So let's start with the brain. Okay. This is the brain. Remember, we talked about the lower brain, the basal ganglia, the reptile, the monkey, the lion, the serpent. I don't know what your animal is, but you're an animal because you have an animal brain. And I've watched a lot of people, they might be bankers, professionals, lawyers, they literally would be on the floor, like, whoa. And then, because they're lawyers and they're bankers, they would stand up, look at their own, I'm late. And then they walk, they run out. But how automatic and easy it was to activate the dinosaur. It doesn't matter how prim and proper. You could be the Queen of England, you could be the Prime Minister of China, they've got an animal brain. I don't care what you look like. You know, you could be Bill Gates, you could be Princess Diana, but deep down, when you're dreaming, you're an animal. So where's the animal brain? It usually resides in the brainstem, but most likely the basal ganglia has something to do with it. What is the basal ganglia? Number one, let's go look at it because it's hard to not be able to visualize. You know, my drawings are clumsy. So this is what we think of as the brain. That's the new brain. That's the modern brain, the elegant, sophisticated, cute brain. The animal brain is going to have to be underneath. This is what the old brain looks like. So if you take out the covering, the cortex, what you get is the old brain. The animal brain is made up of many parts. The putamen, the globus pallidus, the thalamus. Hippocampus is responsible for memory. The caudate and the amygdala is responsible for emotions. So we don't need to go too deep into this, but it actually helps when it's spoken about that, okay, that's the old brain. And next time you study it, at least it now exists in your system. Oh, that's what I'm activating. I don't need to keep pointing people's bodies. That's the one that actually does it. So anything that stimulates that, whether you touch people or not, that's really what you're targeting. Let's look at the chemicals that are interchanging in the basal ganglia or the animal brain. What's allowing people to become animals? How do you trigger the animal in people? So the most addictive chemical is not cocaine. It's not cocaine. It's not crystal meth. What is the most addictive chemical on the planet?
Sugar.
Sugar? No. What's the most addictive chemical on the planet?
Power.
Power? That's not a chemical. Yes, she's right. We love you. It's dopamine. Dopamine is addictive. We want to ask why and how are we triggering dopamine in the healing process. A lot of people would rather that this was not talked about because it's boring and it reveals that we're just getting people high. We're doping people. Dopamine does have spiritual, if it's not just addictive, it's responsible for paying attention. That's the prefrontal cortex. It needs to be sent there. For emotions, that's when it's sent to the amygdala. Dopamine is also sent to the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for moving your body. And then dopamine is also sent to the hippocampus, where you can remember things. So when you don't have a healthy dopaminergic system ongoing, then it's really hard to pay attention. People experience something called ADHD. One of the disorders, the emotional and psycho disorders that are being studied when dopamine becomes too much, is psychosis and schizophrenia. It helps us to remember, though, and it helps us to move our bodies. So the disorder that is usually understood to be related to a decrease in dopamine production and reception is Parkinson's. So when the dopamine production stops and it's not going into the DA receptors in the brain, that's Parkinson's. So if you want to help someone with Parkinson's, creating the wave really helps, because dopamine is very sensitive to music. It's very sensitive to rhythm, especially. It's very sensitive to vibration. So when you give people sound, dopamine can rise up again and assist with memory, movement, emotion, and attention. All of that is all well and good. Now, I think having said that, we want to understand how then is that helping to bring people into the trance. What we're actually doing is we're rerouting dopamine that's usually going into... Can you see now why dopamine is addictive? Let's say, what are people addicted to? Give me an addiction. Sure, okay, let's talk about chocolate ice cream. So a lot of people think dopamine makes people happy. It's not. Dopamine builds expectation. Yesterday, you remember we talked about anticipation? A lot of dopamine, if you want to activate dopamine, here's a tip to space holders. You want to activate dopamine? All you need to do is give them a drum beat. The dopamine's looking for a rhythm. So going into your experiences yesterday, can you now see the part of you that's needing a rhythm? Something regular. It's not just a heartbeat. It's actually dopaminergic, because what scientists have found out recently is dopamine cells are actually time cells. We found out that one of the parts of the brain that keeps time is dopamine. Dopamine keeps time. So you can control dopamine through the BPM. That already gives you control over the autonomic nervous system. You can control what's controlling through the beat, because you can cascade all of that. Okay, it starts with that which builds anticipation, and I can control the exact BPM that I would like the vibration to hold. A beat is anything that holds regular pulse perception. But when I change that, your brain isn't able to hold on to regularity. What you're actually doing with music is you're organizing time. Rhythm organizes time. And so when you go to a cafe and some music is playing, you go to a disco, you go to a festival, when you enter and then when there's something going on, it's going to change your time perception, because this is what this does. Depending on how much you trigger or trust, you're going to be altering people's time perception. Do you want them to go into a childhood thing, which we heard yesterday? Do you want them to go to space? Do you want them to go into an inner dialogue with their mother or their boss or an alien? You need to alter time. So can you understand the space that you're holding? It's called a time machine. that this is merely a description. I need to go much deeper so that you understand. Okay, so then what about dopamine? Explain that to me.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
Is it also why some people we are reacting really very fast?
Yeah.
They start moving very fast. Is it because they have a higher dopamine level?
It means that your brain is highly sensitized, and that means your amygdala, your emotional brain, is very sensitive. It means your basal ganglia easily receives information. Small stimulants would already like do it for you.
Yeah, I noticed yesterday when people were
Yes.
there, started moving.
Emotionally sensitive people are usually trusting people. They don't have the stay away from me. You're super sensitive. You're super empathic. You have to always protect yourself because you're feeling a lot. So that means your nervous system, even maybe the smallest thing, and then we just leave you alone. You're already there. So we're interested in that, and then you will meet people who is not like you. They're going to be like, you have a sledgehammer there, and they're just there, like, nothing. It would take time even just to elaborate on that. But in general, the emotional parts, they also trigger the basal ganglia. So the amygdala can trigger the basal ganglia. It's usually the prefrontal cortex that's trying to think too much. So a lot of the techniques that people have been learning is when you reroute dopamine from the thinking brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you want to be exact. That's the one that's always trying to sequence things. A normally goes to B, B will go to C. Basal ganglia just doesn't care. All these weird connections are happening in the old brain system, and the new brain really just needs to go to work, take care of the children, and do the laundry once or twice a week. You do need that. So you don't just want the basal ganglia, but you do want them to talk to each other. So dopamine exists in the basal ganglia. When you send dopamine then to here, to this region, then something happens. So I drew the whole brain and not just the basal ganglia to help us understand that dopamine is not the only chemical that's being sent and received in the basal ganglia. The actual chemicals that are being sent back and forth is glutamate and GABA. Okay, so this is really important for anyone who's going to stimulate. Glutamate is the most stimulatory chemical in the human body. It's the most numerous. It's excitatory. Too much glutamate, too much activation will poison the brain. So too much glutamate will become poisonous, and it will make people dumb. It will stop the thinking process. It normally actually leads to learning, but too much will be poisonous. So what balances that is GABA. So when GABA is high, GABA inhibits, glutamate stimulates. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to hold both. Because you notice when you're doing too much stimulation, people just break out. Now I'm thinking, you broke me out. You shook my body. You point me way too often, and you just brought me back into the room. Some people were expressing that. I really just wanted to be left alone. That means they were working under GABA state. And that's nothingness. GABA allows for nothingness. It holds zero. It allows people to go into the void. And the biggest function of that is the learning experience. GABA is usually expressed, it's here, non-REM stage 3. Remember, some people went into the nothingness yesterday. This is called slow wave sleep. This is called delta state. And in a 24-hour cycle, this is the closest you will come to the brain state of death. It's the slowest. It's the slowest. It's the most restful. That's supposedly when short-term memories are encoded into long-term memory. That's a precursor of going into the REM state or the dream. So something needs to drop very low. And what is responsible for that is GABA. What you want to learn as a facilitator is to hold the GABAergic and the glutamatergic. Like, it's not just then the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the question is, does that explain inner dance? It's a precursor as well. We're on the way. That doesn't yet explain why does inner dance happen. So glutamate and GABA are usually balancing each other. They're trying to balance each other so that you don't explode. Too much glutamate, you'll explode. So GABA tries to balance things out. Here's when an inner dance explodes. Usually glutamate and GABA are able to balance each other. Now remember, dopamine normally goes to the motor functions, attention, memory, and emotion. So this morning and yesterday, something's wrong with my iPhone. So it just keeps dropping. Do you remember when the music would just stop? And then I need to put something on. One of the oldest techniques in inner dance has always been what's already become a law, a rule. It's called the law of contrast. Usually when you change the energy, you can call it the rhythm or the vibration. So let's say you have a regular rhythm that's high, it could be 100 something BPM. And then when you suddenly drop it, boom. When you drop it from a high frequency, fast vibration, you drop it, boom. And a lot of you have probably experienced this in the past. Something happens.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Does it need to be rhythm or also
No.
like music color?
Yeah, it could be tonality. It could be any change that drops it from a high place into a low place. That's usually when it happens. It's usually when the experience happens. So let's say people were feeling the rise of the... When you drop it, an emotion comes through. There has to be a jump between genres, colors, tonality, the texture, and especially the tempo. That's when it happens, like a drop from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic. Boom. So that's why you want to have a library. You don't want to just keep stimulating people. You want like an energy bed that stimulates and then drops, depress them. Why are we doing that? What's the point? You remember dopamine goes into the 4 centers we talked about: attention, memory, movement, and emotion. And these are separate parts, except movement is inside the basal ganglia. When you change the music and the energy, the way you're holding people, when there's a contrast, you reroute dopamine. You're with me? You reroute dopamine into the basal ganglia. That's when it suddenly goes into the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia will receive it, and it will do something to glutamate and GABA. Okay? Remember, glutamate is excitatory. It stimulates. And you know what dopamine does? It's going to amplify glutamate. It's going to multiply. It's going to create an exponential effect so that glutamate, the arrow would be that big. And the technique, as I'm explaining to you, is you need to shock the system. You need to change the expectation. You can see what dopamine is trying to do. It's trying to make you anticipate or expect something. And when there's like a quick surprise that you got something that you weren't expecting, that's when the pleasure comes. The real pleasure is like when you get something you weren't expecting. So does that start to explain to you what expectations actually do? When you're anticipating, even if you're getting the stimulus, if you're actually expecting it and you're wanting it, it's not going to happen. It won't go into the basal ganglia that amplifies glutamate. So in the first stages, that has a function because it stops the brain from thinking. And that will activate a lot of the body-based processes and the other brain processes outside the basal ganglia that's more. That's not filtering things through the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's usually fear-based. It's trying to sequence the day only based on what your neocortex can hold at that time. If you want to borrow body-based wisdom, which is very nonlinear, that's one of the reasons why you're activating the basal ganglia. So any questions on that? This is really an explanation that you're getting here. It explains why music, brain theory, and many other things, like autonomic nervous system, and all the tools that you've been learning, even just getting the body to position itself, laying down. One of our main tips to people, if you want people to open the left brain, is to extend the right arm. The right arm is an extension of the left brain. The left brain is dad. Mom is the right brain for right-handed people. If you're the opposite, that means language probably exists here. Very few people are left-handed. Who here is left-handed? That means you keep your language center in your right brain. Most people keep it in their left brain. So then we need to extend your left arm. Your sequential thinking process is in where you contralateralize language. So maybe you should ask, okay, before we do the session, are you right-handed or left-handed? But mostly in a group of 100, we can't ask that, so we normally extend the right arm, which opens up the sequential thinking brain, which manages time. So even if you don't do much, leave them alone with the music, they'll actually start going there. Because you opened up, your dad is always like that. You want to open dad, you extend the right arm. And then they start to meet, mom and dad. That's like a first explanation, right? So I think we need to bring that to the body. We now want to bring that to the body. We know how the mechanisms work on the level of neurotransmitters. If you want to understand how that drops down to chemistry, we need to go into hormones. How are you affecting the hormones? So that means I think we need to get away from the brain, and then we need to. Yes, please. It's a really good question. Did everyone hear her question? Is it dangerous does this present some dangers in terms of overstimulation and whatnot? Facilitators, they found out that they can activate dopamine, amplifying glutamate by shocking the system, creating contrasts between music. But remember when I said when you keep sticking to that one experience that shocked the system, they won't be shocked anymore. So then they keep going into the contrast again and again in the same way. So the shocking experience is not shocking. And then when they keep going there, that's how it can get addictive. So my advice to space holders is keep thinking about different inputs that inhibit and stimulate so that they don't get stuck. Some, maybe you call them patients, clients, participants, friends, they don't have that much structure in their body though. So it is okay to give them enough regularity that they can train their body to get shocked in similar ways. But if you keep that going for beyond the necessary duration, then people can get stuck. I'm not really looking at maybe a physical disorder. I would just be looking at maybe, well, addictions can lead to really bad body-based problems and mental problems for sure. So I think that's what we know so far anyway. I would say addiction would be the biggest danger. Having enough variation in the way you stimulate people so that you're shocking them in new ways will lead to, the benefit of that is neuroplasticity. It will allow them to create connections that are new, that helps them to think in different ways and to perceive, and emotionally they won't be so reactive You'll be able to bring emotional plasticity so that if their fear responses are too habituated, you don't want them to react to dangerous situations if the danger actually isn't there anymore. It was there when they were children. That now anxiety is really more of a coping mechanism because of trauma. You want to shift trauma, then. Her question is, do we have experience about people who are taking the Parkinson's medication? I normally am conservative in a way that I don't like to order people to stop whatever their doctors are advising. Because if, let's say, we can have an energy-based intervention alongside, like something that's within the norms and standards of, it must be up to the practitioner. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. If it's internal, yes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. 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 I agree with you because what the brain normally does is it synthesizes the chemical, and then I think the gating mechanism would be in the receptor level. There would be these receptors for dopamine, receptors for serotonin, for oxytocin, and normally when you've had enough, the body has a gating mechanism. There are stimulating neurotransmitters, and then there's usually the inhibiting neurotransmitters. If you want to get like specific to that, let's say the corticotropic releasing hormone also has corticotropic inhibiting hormone. There's a prolactin inhibiting hormone, and so there's usually like the inhibitory element is always waiting when you've had too much. So the body does have these tendencies in the short and the long term. But thank you, and thank you. That actually brings settlement here. Trying to remember where we're at. So I think we're trying to talk about the body-based chemistry now. And I think that's very interesting because that takes us away from the brain and into the heart. Okay, so we're interested in time. Remember, we're talking about time perception. What in the heart holds time? It's called the sinoatrial mode, the SA node. The SA node also has time cells or time perception functions. It regulates the heartbeat. What we're thinking about here now is, now that we know the mechanisms in the brain helping you to design your workshops and your sessions better, what's happening in the lower part of the body? That's actually, this is the spine, and then it's stimulating or inhibiting the heartbeat. Okay, so as we said, the SA node holds it's called a pacemaker, basically. It's the pacemaker for the heart. The VA node follows whatever the SA node is sending based on, so this holds pulse perception. Let's go to the experience. When you're experiencing the music and it's purely spacious, there's no heartbeat. And one of the reasons why people don't like arrhythmic or non-rhythmic music is the moment you really experience that truly is when you die. When there's no more tempo, people are scared of music that doesn't have, when they're in certain states, they don't like music without the tempo because it simulates death. So if you want to bring people into death, like we know this facilitator in Scotland, that's her expertise. Every time she does in her dance, she always kills people. Murder, death, kill. She's really good at it, and when you check out her music, it's filled with really low, earthy, like didgeridoo, super low tones. And then everyone has this near-death experience. I died, I went up to heaven and talked to Jesus, like I died. Everyone dies in her session. So when you study Caroline's playlist, it's very, it holds a lot of bass, undertones, really low harmonics, super slow waves, because there's no heartbeat. You're not giving them the remembrance that the heart stops beating as a simulation. So now that we know that the SA node of the heart holds the pacemaker, like time perception is pulse perception. We already empowered you that, okay, if I change the pulse, rhythm organizes time. I can either bring them to aliens or the tribal people, the cavemen. Like, who needs drugs anyway? Who needs drugs when you can, when drugs really just actually either activate the sympathetic and the parasympathetic? I mean, if you really want to be a pusher, what we really want to talk about are the 3 types of drugs. There's basically actually 4. There's the stimulants, there's the depressants. What else are there? There's 2 more, right? Hallucinogens. Hallucinogenic. And this is what you're doing in inner dance. You're getting people to take magic mushrooms without magic mushrooms. Hallucinogenics are chemicals that stimulate and depress at the same time. That's why you don't need ayahuasca. That's why people, when they go to inner dance, they've said it through the years, this is like ayahuasca. This is even stronger than ayahuasca. Because you're stimulating and depressing at the same time. What's the 4th kind of drug? It's an antipsychotic. So a lot of the drugs people take are either stimulating, depressing, hallucinating, or antipsychotic. I think that's important to mention for those who haven't had that in their, whatever they're doing. So we've determined, again, going back, okay, pacemaker, what stimulates the SA node? That's our question, right? What stimulates the SA node? There has to be a chemical there. So again, you cascade a certain rhythm, let's say delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. They will stimulate certain waves. So what you're interested in is what are the chemical effects of these in the body and in the brain. I'm really just thinking out loud here through these images. So what you would be looking at would be the stimulatory hormones and then the inhibitory hormones. And what are those? Stimulatory would be what? Yes, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Some people would like to call it adrenaline or noradrenaline. It's the same. At least you are familiar with what adrenaline does. And then there's, what else? Okay, well, that doesn't so much, is to do with the heart, but those are good. The other one that's major is cortisol, right? The stress hormone. And then what are the relaxing inhibitory hormones? Acetylcholine. So this is the major one. This is what the parasympathetic nervous system uses. And this is what the sympathetic nervous system uses. And we need to wake up, you need to be alert. That's what you use. The parasympathetic slows, balances down through acetylcholine. You're trying to balance these out. What we know about the SA node is that what actually helps to hold the pacemaking are adrenergic receptors in the heart. In the SA node has adrenergic receptors in the heart. So what does that mean? Adrenergic receptors are receptors for epinephrine or norepinephrine, which are powerful catecholamines or stimulatory hormones. Facilitators should know this. They should know how this works. This is something that you can overstimulate. I think this is what you can overstimulate. And we would need to look at another chart in order to understand what that could be. And it has something to do with this. Okay? Now understand that cortisol is, as the stress hormone, has timing. It goes down. When is the lowest point of cortisol or the stress hormone? Midnight. The nadir or the 0 point is at midnight. So it starts to go down maybe 2 or 3 hours after you go to sleep. And melatonin is the dream chemical. Melatonin is a spiritual chemical. It's sent out by the pineal gland, and it is what allows you to dream. And there's a part of your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that sends out the signals depending on when it's light or dark. It tells you, okay, it's time to go to sleep. It's time to go and dream. So can you see how the workshop or the journey is perfectly designed? It's so perfectly designed. It doesn't matter what time of the day. Like we did a session this morning. What time is that again? 9 o'clock. So let's look at the chart that we just brought up. 9 o'clock. And this will help you think about, how do I design the wave depending on what time of the day it is? Understanding that cortisol is stimulatory and melatonin is inhibitory. 9 o'clock would be here. So cortisol level is actually supposed to be super high at 9. And then melatonin level is supposed to be low. So can you see what we're trying to do? We're trying to extend your melatonin level at 9 o'clock when you came here. And we're trying to drop cortisol levels so that you can dream. Because dream time normally is at its height. Let's look at another chart. Dream time should be highest. Many charts would have cortisol being super high at 3 o'clock in the morning. Have you ever heard of the expression witching hour? That the most spiritual hour of the day is 3 o'clock in the morning. Does that explain it? Melatonin, which brings you into dimensions, is highest at 3 o'clock in the morning. And cortisol is only about to climb, which stimulates you just a little bit. In Maya, our most amazing inner dances are at 7 o'clock in the morning. This is when we do inner dance. And in your city, when do people do workshops? At night. That's actually not the best. It's not always the best. It's very hard to bring certain energy levels up. So you're working with a yoga studio, you're working with a center, you're working at home. Think about it. Start the day right. That's actually when you're still holding residues of REM state. A lot of healing can happen then. At this time, you're already supposed to drop. Interestingly, like cortisol and melatonin are usually inversely moving, contradicting each other. And it's interesting that now think of the workshop. Think of the inner dance. You ask someone to lay down. It doesn't matter what time. And you're tricking. You're like a joker. You're making their body pretend it's time to go to bed. And when you do that, you are activating that part of the circadian rhythm that's called the sleep stages. You're making the body pretend that it's about time to go to sleep, even though they're awake. It doesn't matter if they had too much coffee. It actually does matter. But meaning, it doesn't matter if it's that time of the day where they're supposed to buy stocks, to go to the store, you're getting them to dream, you're changing this rhythm. It doesn't matter what time of the day it is. Through the power of entrainment, brainwave entrainment, like circadian entrainment or cardiovascular entrainment, you're changing the chemistry of the body, the whole timing mechanism. So when you do look at charts like this is not a Kundalini chart, by the way. This is epilepsy, and that is what we're doing. We're making people epileptic. This is a spine, and when cortisol and melatonin levels are expressed heavily, this is what happens. Do you understand now why it happens? Cortisol and melatonin are supposed to be opposite each other. So what happens when you express cortisol and melatonin at the same time? You stimulate the sympathetic and parasympathetic at the same time. That's your tool. That's your science. That's your gift. Right? You're creating this confusion. You're creating this confusion in people where they're not able to decide whether it's light or dark. You're giving them this non-dual experience of cold and hot, light and dark, east and west, masculine, feminine. So they're able to hold both, slow and fast. You're giving them the whole range. And their mind is normally filtering, can't decide, is this good for me or bad for me? It's all okay. I accept it. I forgive you. I love you. Everything is okay. You're giving them all these stimulus to activate safe, scary, all in one. They can't make a decision. You're giving them the sun and the moon at the same time so that they become non-dual. Let's go back to this. So the heart is always making decisions. And the SA node does that through time. When we talk about time, what are we really looking at? Speed, velocity, meaning, which is to say, like fast and slow are decisions, right?